When I first bought my new home, I thought I was stepping into the peaceful life I had always dreamed of. Quiet mornings on the porch with a cup of coffee, the sound of birds in the trees, and evenings where I could finally breathe without the stress of city traffic or the interference of noisy neighbors. The place was perfect for me, an older but sturdy house just outside a well-known neighborhood that happened to be run by an HOA. My property, however, was technically not under their jurisdiction, and that was part of why I had chosen it. I wanted the freedom to enjoy my home without constant surveillance or demands from people who thought they had authority over every blade of grass and shade of paint. Little did I know that this decision would make me the target of the self-appointed queen of the HOA, Karen. I had heard about her before I moved in, mostly in the form of neighborhood gossip. She was the type who memorized the HOA handbook like it was scripture, patrolled the streets as if she were a police officer, and treated every house as though she personally owned it. My realtor even warned me with a laugh, saying, "Don't worry, you're not in her HOA, but she'll still think you are." At the time, I chuckled at the idea and brushed it off as an exaggeration, but I was not prepared for how quickly her intrusive personality would surface after I moved my boxes in. On the very first day, as the movers were unloading my furniture, I saw her marching down the street in her pastel sweater, oversized sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, and an expression on her face that looked like she had smelled something rotten. She didn't introduce herself with a friendly smile or a welcoming gesture. Instead, she pointed at my house with a manicured finger and said in a voice loud enough for the entire block to hear, "You can't move in there. That property isn't approved for occupancy." I remember blinking at her in disbelief, thinking maybe she had me confused with someone else, but when I explained politely that this was my house, that I had the legal paperwork, and that it was outside the HOA boundaries, her face turned red, and her voice rose even louder. "Nonsense," she snapped. "This entire street is HOA territory. We have rules, and you need to follow them. That paint color is not approved, your driveway is the wrong length, and you are not allowed to have that type of fence." I stared at her, trying to figure out if she was serious, but the absolute conviction in her tone told me she wasn't bluffing. My movers exchanged amused looks, one of them whispering, "She's one of those, huh?" And I just sighed, forcing myself to keep calm. I tried again to explain, pulling out my deed and paperwork that clearly showed the property line. My home was not part of the HOA development. Karen, however, wasn't having it. She snatched the papers from my hands without asking, scanning them like she was some kind of lawyer, then thrust them back at me with a dismissive wave. "This doesn't matter. You can't just move into this community and ignore the standards that keep our property values up. If you think you're going to drag down this neighborhood with your unapproved choices, you have another thing coming." The audacity of her words stunned me, but I kept my cool. I reminded her gently that she had no authority here, that my house was not in her HOA, and that she needed to respect my space. That's when she completely lost it. She began shouting, accusing me of trying to sneak in under the radar, claiming that people like me were parasites who ruined neighborhoods because we didn't pay dues or follow the rules. By then, a few other neighbors had stepped out of their homes to watch the spectacle, some shaking their heads in embarrassment, while others simply stared in curiosity. It was clear from their reactions that this wasn't the first time Karen had gone on one of her power trips, but it was the first time I had been on the receiving end. She demanded I leave immediately, insisting she would call the HOA board, and even the police if I didn't vacate the property that same day. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but instead of giving her the satisfaction of an argument, I simply said, "Call whoever you like, but this is my home, and I'm not going anywhere." That only made her angrier. She stomped her foot like a child, turned on her heel, and stormed back to her house, shouting over her shoulder that I hadn't heard the last of this. My movers chuckled nervously, asking if I wanted them to continue unloading. I told them yes, absolutely. If anything, Karen's outburst just made me more determined to settle in quickly. Still, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling in my stomach. I knew this wasn't the end, and something told me that moving into my dream home was about to turn into a battle I never asked for. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking, no, pounding, on my front door like they were trying to break it down. I threw on a t-shirt, still groggy from unpacking late into the night, and opened it only to find Karen standing there with a clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her nose, even though the sun hadn't fully risen yet. She looked like she had prepared for battle. Hair sprayed stiff, lips pursed, and a stack of papers that she shoved toward me without so much as a good morning. These, she announced with self-importance, are the HOA guidelines. You'll need to bring your property into compliance immediately. I didn't even bother reaching for the papers because I already knew what she was trying to do. Karen, I said, keeping my voice steady, I told you yesterday, my property isn't in your HOA. Your rules don't apply to me. That should have been the end of it, but instead she stepped 1 foot into my entryway, crossing a line both literally and figuratively, as if she owned the place. Don't play dumb with me, she snapped. This entire street is part of the HOA's jurisdiction. You can't just declare yourself exempt. I pointed directly at the street sign at the end of my driveway and explained, again, that the boundary line for the HOA stopped several houses down. Check your own map, I told her. This house was built before your development, and it's excluded. She glared at me like I had just spoken blasphemy. That's a technicality, she scoffed. And technicalities don't save property values. Her obsession with property values was starting to sound like a broken record, but I realized it was her main weapon. If she could stir up fear among the neighbors that my house would somehow devalue theirs, she could rally support against me. I was about to ask her to leave when she dramatically scribbled something on her clipboard, ripped off a sheet of paper, and slapped it against my chest. Consider this your first violation notice, she declared, before spinning on her heel and marching down my driveway like she had just delivered a court summons. I looked at the paper baffled and couldn't help but laugh. It was literally a homemade violation notice she had printed on her computer, complete with clip art of a gavel at the top. The absurdity of it almost made me feel sorry for her. But the way she was trying to intimidate me made my blood boil. Later that day, I started meeting more of the neighbors as they came by to introduce themselves, perhaps curious after witnessing yesterday's spectacle. Most were friendly and welcoming, bringing over small gifts or just stopping by for chat. A few of them even rolled their eyes when I mentioned Karen's antics, telling me she had harassed almost everyone at one point or another. She once fined me for leaving my trash can out for an extra day, one neighbor confided, even though it was because the garbage truck broke down. She doesn't care about reasons, she just wants control. Another laughed and said, she's like a wannabe dictator, but don't worry, most of us don't take her seriously. Their reassurances were comforting, but they also came with a warning. She doesn't back down easily. If she's decided you're her target, she'll keep coming after you. That prediction came true faster than I expected. By the afternoon, Karen had returned, this time dragging along a man she introduced as the HOA board president, though from the look on his face, he clearly wasn't thrilled to be there. This is Mr. Thompson, she announced, as though she were parading a witness in court. He's here to explain to you why you can't just ignore the HOA. Mr. Thompson gave me a sheepish smile and said, look, I don't want to cause trouble. Technically, your house is outside our jurisdiction. Karen immediately cut him off, snapping, that's debatable. He tried again, but it's not worth fighting about. We can't enforce anything on you. Karen's eyes widened with fury, as if he had just betrayed her on live television. Don't undermine me, Harold, she hissed through clenched teeth. This is about the integrity of our neighborhood. I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms, and said, so we're done here, right? Because I've got boxes to unpack. Mr. Thompson nodded quickly, clearly eager to leave, but Karen wasn't finished. She rounded on me, jabbing her finger in my direction. You may think you found a loophole, but I promise you this, you will regret moving here. I will make sure of it. With that, she stormed off again, dragging poor Mr. Thompson behind her, who shot me an apologetic look as they left. That night, I found a note taped to my front door, written in bold capital letters. This is your final warning. Leave immediately or face the consequences. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably Karen's. My initial reaction was disbelief, This woman had clearly crossed from being annoying into being threatening, but then I felt anger rising in me. Who did she think she was? This was my home, bought legally, and no power-hungry neighbor was going to intimidate me out of it. Still, I couldn't ignore the tension brewing. I realized Karen wasn't going to stop at words or empty violation notices. She was escalating, and I needed to prepare myself for whatever her next move would be. The following week was a roller coaster of absurd confrontations and passive aggressive tactics that made me feel like I was living in some kind of reality show where the villain was a middle aged woman in pastel cardigans with too much time on her hands. At first, I tried to ignore Karen, thinking maybe if I didn't engage, she would eventually grow tired and move on to some other poor neighbor. But it quickly became clear that ignoring her only emboldened her. One morning, I walked outside to find that someone, gee, I wonder who, had spray painted the words HOA rules apply across my driveway in giant sloppy letters. The paint was still fresh, and though I couldn't prove it, I didn't need to be a detective to know Karen was behind it. I reported it to the local police, who were sympathetic but shrugged, saying unless I had video evidence, there wasn't much they could do beyond making a note of it. When they offered to stop by her house for a friendly chat, I agreed, if only to let her know I wasn't going to let her antics go unchecked. Sure enough, not an hour later, I saw a patrol car outside her house and Karen standing in the driveway, arms crossed, lips pursed like she was preparing for battle. I couldn't hear the conversation, but from the way her hands flailed and her head shook violently, I could guess she was denying everything and painting herself as the victim. Later that day, she actually had the audacity to march over to my property and accuse me of harassing her with false police reports. I told her flat out that if the vandalism didn't stop, I would be installing cameras around my home, and if I caught her or anyone else, I'd press charges. She sneered at me, saying, "Go ahead. Cameras won't stop me from protecting this neighborhood." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, like she truly believed she was some kind of vigilante sworn to enforce imaginary laws. Things escalated even further when she began rallying other neighbors to her cause. She went door to door, handing out flyers that declared me an outsider and accused me of being a danger to property values, safety, and the community spirit. Some neighbors tossed the flyers straight in the trash, others quietly rolled their eyes, but a few, those who either feared her or genuinely bought into her nonsense, started avoiding me, whispering as I walked by. It was frustrating because I had done nothing wrong, yet I was being painted as the villain in her bizarre crusade. To combat her smear campaign, I decided to get ahead of it by hosting a small cookout for the neighborhood. I invited everyone, made sure to have plenty of food and drinks, and tried to show them I was just a normal guy who wanted to be part of the community. The event went well for the most part. Families came, kids played in the yard, and I had good conversations with a lot of people. That is, until Karen showed up uninvited, standing just outside my property line like some kind of cartoon villain. She didn't step onto my lawn, but she shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't be fooled. He's bribing you with hamburgers, so you'll ignore his violations. This is a con." People groaned, some even telling her to go home, but she stayed until she realized no one was paying attention to her, at which point she stormed off in a huff. Still, the damage she was trying to cause lingered in the back of my mind. I knew she wasn't going to stop with just flyers or verbal harassment. And sure enough, my fears were confirmed when I received an official-looking envelope in the mail a few days later. Inside was a notice of lien against my property claiming I owed thousands of dollars in unpaid HOA dues. My heart nearly stopped when I saw it, until I realized, after reading more carefully, that the document was completely fake. It wasn't filed with any government office, it wasn't signed by anyone with legal authority, and it looked suspiciously like something printed from a template she found online. But the fact that she had gone to the trouble of fabricating legal documents told me just how far she was willing to go. I immediately called my lawyer, who laughed at the ridiculousness of it, but also advised me to keep every single piece of paper, note, and flyer she produced. "People like this," he said, "dig their own graves when you keep a record." Eventually, She'll cross a line that even the law can't ignore. That gave me some comfort, but it didn't make living next to her any easier. By this point, she had escalated to calling the police on me for trivial, made up reasons, noise complaints when I was quietly reading on the porch, illegal construction when I was planting a garden, even suspicious activity when I had friends over. Each time, the officers showed up apologetically, clearly annoyed at being dragged into her vendetta, but still obligated to check things out. One even muttered to me, "She's infamous around here. We get calls from her all the time." I realized then that Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor, she was a full-blown menace who believed she was above the law. And unless I put my foot down, she would continue to make my life miserable. I had moved here for peace and quiet, but instead I was living in a daily war zone, constantly looking over my shoulder for whatever new scheme Karen would unleash. And yet, despite her relentless attacks, I also felt a strange sense of determination building inside me. She thought she could scare me off, but she had underestimated me. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had been terrorizing the neighborhood for far too long. By the time the fourth week rolled around, I had finally decided enough was enough. Karen had gone from being an annoying busybody to a genuine threat to my right to live peacefully in my own home, and if she thought her intimidation tactics were going to drive me out, she was dead wrong. The fake liens, the vandalism, the flyers, the police calls, everything was piling up, and I had meticulously documented it all. Photos of the spray paint on my driveway, recordings of her shouting outside my home, copies of her violation notices and final warnings, even the fabricated lien with her unmistakable handwriting on the envelope. I realized I had enough evidence to build a case against her, but before I could even begin that process, Karen struck again, this time escalating to an almost comical level of insanity. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard the sound of hammering outside my window. Curious, I stepped onto my porch and froze at the sight. Karen, in broad daylight, was attempting to put up a wooden sign in my front yard that read, "Foreclosure, property seized by HOA." I nearly laughed at the ridiculousness of it, but my laughter quickly turned into anger when I realized she had trespassed onto my property yet again. I marched straight up to her, demanded she remove the sign, and told her she was breaking the law. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she crossed her arms, gave me that smug smirk I had come to despise, and said, "This house will never belong to you. You don't belong here. You leave, or I'll make sure you're forced out." That was the final straw. I pulled out my phone, recorded her mid-threat, and called the police right there in front of her. For the first time, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she tried to cover it up by saying, "Go ahead, call them. They'll take my side." But when the police arrived and I showed them the video of her trespassing, vandalizing, and making threats, the tone shifted entirely. The officers were no longer just humoring her. They were stern, asking her to explain why she was on my property installing a fake foreclosure sign. She sputtered, red-faced, trying to justify it with the same tired line about protecting property values and enforcing HOA rules, but the officers cut her off. "Ma'am," one of them said firmly, "this home is not in your HOA. You have no authority here. And if you continue to harass or trespass, you will be charged." Karen tried to argue, but when she realized the officers weren't buying her story, she stormed off, shouting that this wasn't over. But it was, at least for her. That night, I finally filed a formal harassment complaint, armed with all the evidence I had gathered. My lawyer took one look at the stack of documents and videos and told me I had a rock-solid case. Within a few weeks, Karen was served with a restraining order, legally barring her from stepping foot on my property or contacting me in any way. When word spread around the neighborhood, I could feel a collective sigh of relief. Turns out, I wasn't the only one she had been tormenting for years. Neighbors came up to me privately, thanking me for standing up to her, admitting that they had been too afraid to confront her themselves. "She's been a nightmare for as long as I can remember," one man said, "but now, maybe we can finally have some peace." Karen, of course, didn't take her downfall gracefully. I would still see her occasionally across the street, glaring at me from behind her curtains like some kind of cartoon villain licking her wounds, but she never dared step onto my property again. Over time, her influence in the neighborhood crumbled. Without the ability to bully people face to face, her power evaporated, and even the HOA board began distancing themselves from her. Rumors circulated that she was eventually voted off the board entirely, stripped of the little authority she once wielded. And me? I finally got to enjoy the home I had worked so hard to buy. Mornings on the porch became peaceful again, evenings were quiet, and the community slowly warmed up to me, no longer clouded by Karen's smear campaign. Looking back, I realized Karen had tried everything in her playbook to push me out. Intimidation, lies, vandalism, fake legal documents, even threats, but none of it worked because bullies only win when people back down. I hadn't just stood my ground for myself. I had done it for everyone she had ever pushed around. It wasn't the kind of battle I expected when I moved into my new home, but in the end, it made me appreciate it even more. Every time I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee watching the sun rise over my yard, I felt a surge of satisfaction knowing I had faced down an HOA Karen and won, not by stooping to her level, but by standing firm, staying calm, and letting the truth do the heavy lifting. This was my home, and no one, especially not a self appointed dictator in pastel cardigans, was ever going to take that away from me.